I bit into the last piece of bread I owned and left half for a goddess I didn't believe in. By morning, I could clone that bread. By evening, I had 4 loaves. My younger brother died of hunger 7 years ago over a miracle smaller than this. Let me start from the actual beginning, because bit into bread and gained magic powers undersells how desperate a decision it actually was. My name is Beck Suil, 21 years old. I rent a small plot of land from Lord Cassius Vesson in a village called Millhaven in the eastern farmlands of Estenor, land that produces just enough to survive in a good year and considerably less than enough whenever the rain doesn't cooperate, which this particular year it hasn't. The drought started 3 months ago. My wheat came in thin, brittle, barely worth the labor of harvesting it. Vesson's tax collectors don't adjust their demands for weather. The rent comes due regardless of what the land actually produced, and by the time I've paid what's owed, what remains for my own family's table has narrowed to the specific, precise mathematics of survival that anyone who's lived through genuine scarcity learns to calculate without conscious thought. I learned that mathematics young. My younger brother Do-hyun died when I was 14 and he was 9 during a famine winter that hit Millhaven hard enough that the village lost 11 children before spring arrived. He wasn't sick. He was hungry for months, in the specific, gradual way that doesn't produce dramatic symptoms until the body simply stops being able to continue. I've been calculating food ever since. Every grain, every scrap, every possible source of nutrition assessed with the specific cold precision of someone who watched calculation's absence kill someone he loved. It's made me careful. Cunning, some in the village call it, not always as a compliment. I don't apologize for the label. Cunning kept me alive when kindness alone killed my brother. This particular evening, 3 months into the drought, I have exactly 1 piece of bread remaining. Stale, hard enough that eating it requires soaking it briefly in what little water I can spare, the specific last resort of a household stretching its final resources toward a harvest that's still weeks away. I'm caught in sudden rain on my way home from checking my fields, and I duck into the ruins of an old shrine at the forest's edge, a forgotten temple to some harvest goddess whose name has faded from local memory along with most of the structure itself. Just crumbling stone walls and a partially intact roof that's kept the interior dry enough to shelter travelers for longer than anyone currently living remembers. I sit against the shrine's central altar, exhausted, hungry, waiting out the rain, and something in the specific, desperate exhaustion of that moment produces an impulse I can't fully explain even now. I take out my last piece of bread, place half of it on the altar's worn stone surface, and eat the other half myself. Not devotion. I don't believe in this forgotten goddess any more than I believe the drought will magically end tomorrow. It's something closer to a bitter, exhausted joke, offering tribute to a deity clearly abandoned by everyone including herself, while simultaneously refusing to fully starve myself for a gesture that probably means nothing. "You're not hungry," I tell the empty shrine, my voice carrying the specific hollow quality that comes from talking to stone that isn't going to answer. "I am. We'll share." The altar flashes blue, not lightning from the storm outside, something else, contained entirely within the shrine's interior, a light that exists in a register my eyes process but my brain initially refuses to accept as real. I'm exhausted, hungry, possibly hallucinating from 3 months of insufficient nutrition. That's the more reasonable explanation, and I nearly convince myself of it before the translucent window materializes directly in my vision. System of abundance, activated owner, Beck Suil, function, food cloning condition, place sample plus taste, its structural analysis required restriction, same sample clonable once per hour, progression, first clone equals ×1, second clone 1 hour later equals ×2, third equals ×3. Window, 24 hours from first cloning. After 24 hours, this sample locks permanently. I stare at text that shouldn't exist, hovering in the air of a ruined shrine, describing a mechanic too specific and too strange to be simple hunger madness. I look at the remaining half of bread sitting on the altar, the offering I made half seriously, half desperately to a goddess I don't believe hears anything. Cautious, testing whether the exhaustion has fully broken my grip on reality, I pick the bread back up and place it directly in the altar's shallow central depression, the specific worn indentation that generations of previous offerings apparently carved into the stone. Clone. X1. A second piece of bread appears beside the first. Identical, same shape, same slight char on one edge from my own oven, same specific staleness that 3 days without fresh baking produces. I don't move for several seconds, processing an impossibility my rational mind wants to reject even as my eyes confirm it repeatedly. I pick up the new loaf. Solid. Real. Smells exactly like the bread I've been rationing for 2 days. I try immediately to clone again, testing the system's actual boundaries rather than simply accepting the first result as a fluke. Cloning available in 59 minutes. The restriction confirms itself precisely as the initial message described. I sit in the ruined shrine, rain still falling outside, staring at 2 identical pieces of bread and a translucent blue window that only I appear able to see, and I do the only thing that makes sense to someone whose entire adult life has been built around careful, patient calculation. I wait. The hour passes slowly, my mind working through implications with the specific, obsessive thoroughness that's defined every important decision I've made since watching hunger kill my brother. If this is real, and 2 identical loaves of bread sitting in front of me suggest it's considerably more real than exhausted hallucination typically produces, the progression described in that first message implies something extraordinary. Not just doubling food, but an escalating multiplication that compounds with each hourly cloning within some kind of limited window before the specific sample becomes permanently unusable. I clone again once the hour passes. Clone, times 2. 2 new loaves materialize, bringing my total to 4. The progression is confirmed, not addition, multiplication, the specific mathematics that transforms a single desperate offering into something considerably larger if I'm patient enough to wait through each hourly interval. I do the math obsessively. The way I've calculated every meal's caloric value since childhood taught me the cost of not calculating carefully enough. If the multiplication continues linearly, x1, x2, x3, x4, each hour, across a full 24-hour window, the eventual total climbs into numbers that would feed not just my own household, but considerably more. I stay in the ruined shrine through the night, clone by hourly clone, watching the pile of bread accumulate around me with the specific, careful attention of someone documenting a phenomenon too important to risk misunderstanding through carelessness. By dawn, the shrine floor holds more bread than my household has possessed at one time in years, dozens of loaves, identical down to the specific char mark from my own oven, produced entirely from half a piece of stale bread and a desperate joke told to an abandoned goddess. I face my first real decision as morning light filters through the shrine's broken roof. Share immediately, risking questions about an impossible source of sudden abundance, or hold back, understand the system more thoroughly, act with the specific patient cunning that's kept me alive through every previous crisis. The calculation isn't difficult given who I am. Sharing carelessly, immediately, with obvious impossible abundance invites exactly the kind of scrutiny that could end with someone more powerful than me, deciding this miracle belongs to them rather than to me. Millhaven has survived droughts before through careful rationing and quiet cooperation among neighbors who've learned not to ask too many questions about where scarce resources originate, provided the resources actually help rather than harm. I gather what the shrine's floor holds, considerably more bread than I could carry in a single trip, requiring 2 exhausting journeys back to my cottage before dawn fully breaks. And I construct, on the walk home, the specific plausible lie that desperate villages rarely question too closely. I found an abandoned storage cache in the forest. Forgotten supplies from some previous traveler or hermit, enough to share carefully among those who need it most. Nobody in Millhaven questions this explanation with any real scrutiny. Hunger makes people pragmatic about the source of relief, provided the relief itself proves genuine and doesn't demand anything troubling in return. I distribute loaves to the households I know are struggling worst. The widow Han with her 3 children. Old Tobias, whose joints no longer let him work his own plot effectively. The family 2 cottages down, whose father broke his leg during planting season and hasn't recovered enough to farm properly since. By the time the system's 24-hour window approaches its conclusion, a warning flickering in my vision an hour before the deadline, informing me that this specific sample will lock permanently once the window closes, I've distributed considerably more bread than my own household required, kept enough reserve to last my family several additional weeks, and confirmed through careful hourly attention exactly how the mechanic actually functions. Warning: 1 hour remaining before permanent lock. I clone one final time, maximizing the window's remaining potential before this particular piece of bread. This specific sample, not bread as a general category, the distinction the system's careful phrasing makes explicit, becomes forever unusable for this purpose. The final total, calculated and confirmed as the 24-hour window closes completely, produces enough bread that I'm forced to store considerable reserves in every available container my cottage possesses. The specific abundance that 3 months of drought-driven scarcity made almost impossible to imagine only yesterday. I sit in my cottage as dawn fully breaks on the second day, exhausted from a sleepless night of careful hourly cloning, surrounded by more food security than my family has possessed since before Do-hyun died, and I process the actual scope of what's just happened to my life. This isn't a single miracle that solves one crisis. This is a mechanism, repeatable, if I understand it correctly, with any food sample I can obtain and successfully taste, subject to the same hourly progression and 24-hour permanent lock that just played out with a single piece of bread. The implications, worked through with the specific obsessive thoroughness that calculating survival has trained into every corner of my thinking, extend considerably beyond simply feeding my own household through one difficult season. I could feed a village. Multiple villages. I could, if the mechanic scales the way this first test suggests, build something considerably larger than survival, an actual fortune, extracted from a system that asks nothing except patience, a taste test, and the willingness to wait through each hourly interval as multiplication compounds toward abundance. I think about Do-hyun, about the specific mathematics of hunger that killed him at 9 years old over a shortage this exact mechanism could have solved 7 years too late to save him. I think about Lord Vessen's unforgiving rent demands, about the drought that's punished my fields regardless of effort, about years of careful, cunning calculation that's kept my family alive, but never once produced genuine abundance rather than merely adequate survival. The blue window flickers, patient, waiting for whatever sample I choose to test next. 21 years of calculating scarcity down to its precise, careful edges. One desperate offering to a forgotten goddess. And now, sitting in my cottage surrounded by more bread than 3 months of drought should have permitted, the specific beginning of something I don't yet fully understand the scale of, but intend, with every calculating instinct that survival has trained into me, to understand completely. I close my eyes, briefly, exhausted past the point sleep typically requires to claim me. Tomorrow, more testing. More careful, patient understanding of exactly what this system permits and exactly how far its abundance might eventually extend. For tonight, for the first time in longer than I can clearly remember, my family will not go to bed hungry. That's where this actually begins. I spend the following week testing the system's boundaries with the same methodical patience that's defined every important survival calculation of my life, treating each experiment as data to be recorded rather than magic to be simply enjoyed. The sample restriction, I confirm through careful repetition, applies to specific instances rather than food categories in general. A second, different piece of bread, baked the same day from the same batch as my original test, opens its own separate 24-hour window, entirely independent of whatever remains locked from the first sample. This isn't bread as an abstract concept becoming permanently clonable. It's this particular loaf, this specific physical instance, subject to its own individual progression and its own individual permanent lock once the window closes. The implication crystallizes with the specific clarity that calculating survival has trained into my thinking. The system doesn't reward possessing one valuable food source. It rewards constant acquisition of new samples, each one representing its own limited, time-bound opportunity that closes forever once exhausted. I test raw grain next. A small portion from my own drought-stunted harvest. Thin and unremarkable by any commercial standard, but genuinely mine, genuinely tasted, genuinely subject to the system's structural analysis requirement. Sample detected. Wheat grain, owner's harvest. Structural analysis. Complete cloning available. I clone across the following 24 hours with the same careful hourly attention I applied to the original bread, watching my meager harvest multiply from a single handful into sacks upon sacks of grain, considerably more than my actual field produced this drought season, considerably more than I could have imagined possessing only 2 weeks earlier. The mathematics work out precisely as the initial test suggested. Linear progression per clone, x1 through whatever number of hourly clonings I manage to complete before the 24-hour window locks the sample permanently. By the window's conclusion, I've accumulated enough wheat to feed my household through the remainder of the drought several times over, with substantial surplus beyond even generous consumption. The specific problem that surplus creates occupies my thinking through the following days. I can't simply sell obvious excess grain in Millhaven, where every neighbor knows precisely how poor my harvest actually was this season. Selling wheat I couldn't possibly have grown invites exactly the kind of scrutiny that could expose whatever this system actually is, and expose me to whoever might decide the miracle belongs to someone more powerful than a struggling tenant farmer. I need distance, a market where nobody knows my harvest's actual yield, where a young farmer selling grain draws no particular suspicion beyond ordinary commercial curiosity. Oakwell sits 3 days' travel from Millhaven, large enough to support genuine commercial trade, distant enough that nobody there has any specific knowledge of my land's actual productivity. I load a cart with a carefully calculated portion of my cloned surplus, leaving enough reserve at home to avoid any risk of apparent scarcity, and make the journey with the specific nervous caution of someone attempting his first real commercial transaction beyond simple village bartering. The Oakwell grain market operates considerably larger than anything Millhaven's small trading post ever approximates. Proper merchant stalls, established pricing structures, the specific organized commerce of a town large enough to require actual market regulation rather than informal neighborly exchange. I sell cautiously at first, testing prices, watching how buyers respond to a young stranger's unremarkable cart of grain. The wheat itself is genuinely excellent quality. The system's cloning apparently preserves whatever condition the original sample possessed, and my harvest, despite its meager quantity, was properly stored and reasonably fresh. I returned to the same market corner across several days, selling steadily but not dramatically, the specific careful pacing that avoids drawing attention while still generating meaningful profit from what cost me nothing beyond patience and hourly attention. A woman approaches on my 3rd day at the Oakwell market, watching my modest operation with the specific evaluating attention of someone who reads commercial patterns professionally rather than casually. "You're not a farmer," she says without preamble, studying my hands with pointed directness. "Or you are, but this grain didn't come from whatever field those calluses suggest you work. Your hands are wrong for the volume you're selling." I process the observation with the specific calculating assessment I apply to any unexpected variable, threat or opportunity, and which response the situation actually warrants. "I'm Suil, and you are Mirahalo. I used to run my father's grain trading business before it collapsed." Her expression carries old, carefully managed bitterness beneath professional composure. I know this market's supply chains intimately, every regular seller, every typical harvest yield for the surrounding farmland, every plausible explanation for unusual volume. "You don't fit any pattern I recognize. Maybe I'm simply efficient. Maybe. Or maybe you have a source you're not eager to discuss, and you're selling cautiously enough to avoid obvious suspicion, but not quite cautiously enough to escape someone who actually watches market patterns for a living." She crosses her arms, the specific posture of someone accustomed to reading people's tells during negotiation. "I'm not interested in exposing you, if that's your concern. I'm interested in the source because whatever it is, it's clearly profitable, and I currently need profitable considerably more than I need to protect strangers' commercial secrets." I study her for a long moment, running the same calculation that's governed every important decision since the shrine first activated. What does honesty cost against what withholding it costs? And which risk actually serves my interest better? "I have a source," I say, choosing careful partial truth over either full disclosure or complete denial. "Stable. Reliable." I'm not ready to explain its exact nature to someone I met an hour ago, but I recognize I'm operating this market inefficiently. I don't know pricing patterns, distribution networks, how to scale beyond simple direct sales without drawing the exact scrutiny you just demonstrated you're capable of applying. "You're offering partnership. I'm offering to pay for expertise I clearly lack, in exchange for expertise I clearly possess but can't fully explain yet, if that arrangement interests you." Mira studies me with the specific extended calculation of someone weighing genuine opportunity against genuine risk, the particular caution of someone who's already watched one business collapse and has no interest in repeating that specific failure through insufficient scrutiny of a new venture. My father's business failed because of price manipulation he couldn't fight, larger interests deliberately undercutting his local market until he couldn't sustain operations, then acquiring his remaining assets for pennies once he'd exhausted his reserves fighting a battle he was never positioned to win. Her voice carries the specific controlled anger of old grief processed but never fully resolved. "I need income. I need it badly enough that I'm willing to work with a stranger who won't fully explain his supply chain, provided the actual business practices remain legitimate and the profit justifies the risk." Legitimate, I confirm. Whatever the source, what I'm selling is real grain, properly grown, properly harvested, sold at fair market rates that happen to be sustainable because my costs are considerably lower than typical suppliers face. That's either the most honest vague explanation I've ever received, or the most carefully constructed lie? Perhaps both, depending on which details you eventually learn. She almost smiles, the specific expression of someone recognizing calculated honesty rather than either naive transparency or obvious deception. Fine, cautious partnership. I handle logistics, pricing, market relationships, the actual business infrastructure that turns raw product into sustainable profit. You handle whatever your source actually is. We split proceeds according to terms we'll need to negotiate properly. Once I've seen enough results to trust the arrangement's actual viability, we settle initial terms over the following days, working through the specific practical details that transform an improvised, cautious market presence into something resembling genuine commercial structure. Mira's knowledge proves immediately valuable. She identifies better pricing strategies, introduces me to buyers I wouldn't have found independently, structures our modest operation to avoid exactly the kind of scrutiny that unusual volume might otherwise attract. That evening, sharing a simple meal at a modest Oakwell tavern while finalizing partnership details, Mira volunteers context I hadn't directly requested but recognize as significant once she offers it. My father didn't just fail through bad luck, she says, working through a bowl of stew with the specific distracted attention of someone processing old pain while discussing practical business matters. He tried to compete honestly against grain suppliers backed by something larger than typical merchant rivalry. A coordinated group. I never learned the full structure, just enough fragments to understand it wasn't random competitive pressure. Several noble houses working together, deliberately manipulating regional grain prices to protect their own agricultural monopolies. Manipulating how? Undercutting honest competitors until they collapsed, then acquiring their routes and relationships for essentially nothing. Or the reverse, artificially restricting supply during lean years to inflate prices beyond what honest harvest yields would justify, ensuring dependent farmers and small merchants stay perpetually indebted to whichever noble house controls their region's actual grain access. Her expression carries the specific weight of someone describing a wound that's scarred over without fully healing. My father called it something before he died in debtor's confinement. The Council of Grain, never formal, never officially acknowledged, but real enough to destroy an honest business that simply tried to compete on merit rather than accepting coordinated exploitation. The name settles into my thinking with specific, cold weight, not yet fully understood in scope or structure, but confirmed as something considerably larger and more organized than simple, scattered noble greed. A coordinated mechanism, deliberately maintaining scarcity and debt across the same kind of farming communities that raised me, that killed my brother, that continue struggling under Lord Vessen's unforgiving rent demands regardless of what any individual season's harvest actually produces. I want to understand this council better, I tell Mira, the specific, careful calculation that's governed every decision since the shrine's activation, now extending toward a target considerably larger than simple personal profit. Eventually, once our own operation is stable enough to survive genuine scrutiny. Why? Revenge for a stranger's father? I think about Do Yun, about hunger that killed a 9-year-old boy through mathematics. A system like the one I now carry could have solved 7 years too late. I think about Millhaven's continued struggle, about how many other villages likely suffer under the exact coordinated exploitation Mira just described. Not revenge, I say. Understanding. If something is deliberately maintaining the kind of scarcity that shaped my entire life, I want to know exactly how it operates before I decide what, if anything, I'm actually capable of doing about it. Mira studies me with renewed attention, the specific reassessment of someone recalibrating initial assumptions based on new information. That's either admirable ambition or dangerous naivety, depending on how this council actually responds to anyone threatening their arrangement. Probably both, I admit. But I've spent 21 years calculating survival within scarcity someone else apparently engineered deliberately. I'd like to at least understand the mechanism before deciding whether understanding is where my ambition needs to stop. She raises her cup, the specific informal toast that feels considerably weightier than the simple gesture initially suggests. To understanding, then, and to whatever comes after, once you've actually achieved it. I drink to the toast, processing the specific expanding scope that a single desperate offering to a forgotten goddess has already produced. Not just personal survival secured, not just a cautious business partnership beginning, but the first concrete outline of an adversary considerably larger than simple bad harvests or unforgiving landlords. The blue window flickers in my peripheral vision, patient as always, waiting for whatever sample I choose to test next. 21 years of calculating scarcity, 2 weeks of understanding a system that multiplies abundance instead. And now, a name. The Council of Grain, attached to whatever force has deliberately maintained the exact hardship that's defined my entire life. I intend to understand it completely, whatever that eventually requires. The trading operation grows over the following 2 months into something considerably more structured than the improvised market stall where Mira first approached me, a genuine, if modest, commercial partnership operating under the name Hollow Bake Trading, the specific compromise she insisted on when I suggested naming it purely for myself. My father's name deserves to mean something again, she said, during the negotiation that settled our formal terms. Even attached to a business he never actually ran. I don't argue the point. Mira's expertise has proven essential to transforming raw cloned abundance into sustainable, legitimate-appearing commerce. She structures our sales across multiple markets to avoid concentration that might draw unwanted scrutiny, negotiates supplier relationships that provide plausible cover for our unusual consistency, manages the specific bureaucratic infrastructure that legitimate trading companies require, but that a single farmer's son would never independently know how to navigate. The core problem the system's mechanics create, however, remains constant regardless of how sophisticated our commercial structure becomes. Every sample locks permanently after its 24-hour window closes, which means sustained profit requires sustained acquisition of new samples, continuously, without pause, because yesterday's abundance cannot be revisited once its window expires. I've cloned everything reasonably available within my own immediate resources: grain, vegetables from my plot, preserved meats I could obtain through ordinary village trade, even wine from a neighbor's modest cellar, purchased outright specifically for cloning purposes. But the specific limitation of my own circumstances, a poor tenant farmer's actual access to diverse food samples, constrains how far this initial approach can scale. I need someone who understands food itself with considerably more sophistication than my own limited farming background provides. Someone who knows rare ingredients, exotic flavors, the specific origins and qualities that might make certain samples particularly valuable once cloned at scale. Bertram Voss finds his way into the partnership through Mira's broader trading connections, though the circumstances of his arrival carry their own specific irony given what I'll eventually need him for. He's a traveling cook, formerly employed in the kitchens of a minor duke in the neighboring territory of Aldemore. Exiled from that position roughly a year earlier following political circumstances, he describes with the specific bitter humor of someone who's processed genuine injustice into wry self-deprecation. I cooked for the wrong faction during a succession dispute, he explains, during our first proper meeting at a tavern Mira arranged for the introduction. The duke I served lost. The duke who won apparently considers loyalty to my previous employer's kitchen staff a disqualifying character flaw, regardless of the fact that cooks don't generally involve themselves in political maneuvering beyond making sure the sauce doesn't separate during dinner. That seems like an unreasonable standard. Court politics rarely concern themselves with reasonable standards. He studies me with the specific assessing curiosity of someone who's spent a career reading people through what they choose to eat and how they discuss it. Mira mentioned you're building something unusual. Trading operation with unconventional sourcing was the specific phrase she used. I've grown more comfortable, over 2 months of partnership, with the specific calculated honesty that reveals just enough truth to secure necessary cooperation without exposing the system's full mechanics to unnecessary risk. I have access to a reliable but limited method of acquiring and multiplying food supplies. The limitation is variety. I need someone who knows what's actually valuable, rare, worth acquiring, beyond simple grain and vegetables I can source locally. Bertram's expression shifts through several stages of professional curiosity as I speak, the specific recalibration of someone recognizing an unusual but potentially compelling opportunity. You're describing exactly the expertise 15 years in Noble Kitchens actually provides. I know origins, seasons, which merchants deal honestly in genuine rarities versus which ones sell inferior goods dressed up as exotic. If your multiplication method is as reliable as you're suggesting, pairing it with actual knowledge of valuable ingredients could produce something considerably more lucrative than grain trading alone. I need someone who travels, tastes, brings back samples of things I'd never encounter through ordinary farming circles. Rare spices, quality wines, delicacies typically reserved for noble tables. I'll pay well for genuine expertise, regardless of whether you fully understand the multiplication method itself. He doesn't ask in that first conversation exactly how the multiplication actually functions. the specific professional discretion of someone who's learned, through hard experience with court politics, that some questions cost more to ask than the answers are worth receiving. He assumes, I'll later realize, some kind of smuggling network or illicit trade connection, a reasonable if incorrect explanation that serves my interests without requiring me to construct an elaborate lie. Bertram becomes, over the following weeks, our dedicated rare goods procurer, traveling to distant markets, tasting exotic ingredients with his considerable trained palate, bringing back samples that I clone through careful hourly progression before hollowback trading offers them as impossibly consistent luxury goods, supposedly sourced through some vague exclusive import network that satisfies curious buyers without inviting deeper investigation. The operation's growing success, inevitably, draws attention closer to home. Lord Cassius Vesson summons me directly on a gray afternoon roughly 10 weeks after the shrine's activation, not the casual acknowledgement a tenant farmer typically receives, but a formal audience at his modest manor house, the specific ceremony that signals genuine concern rather than routine landlord business. Vesson himself proves less imposing than his summons initially suggested, a practical, somewhat threadbare aristocrat in his 50s, managing a minor holding that's never provided the wealth his title theoretically implies, the specific tired pragmatism of nobility without genuine resources to match noble pretension. "You've paid your rent on time," he says, without preamble, studying me across his study's worn wooden desk. First time in 5 years of tenancy. Millhaven hasn't reported a single hunger complaint this winter, despite this year's harvest being objectively worse than last year's, according to my own steward's assessment. Explain this. I've prepared, through weeks of anticipating exactly this kind of scrutiny, the specific calculated partial truth that provides plausible explanation without exposing genuine mechanics. I've developed a successful trading arrangement, my lord. Distant markets, favorable prices on grain and goods I can source efficiently. The profits let me pay rent reliably and help neighbors through difficult months. A tenant farmer developing successful distant trade relationships. Vesson's tone carries the specific skeptical weight of someone who's heard many explanations across a career managing tenants and knows which ones typically conceal something less innocent than stated. That's an unusual transformation for someone I've known 5 years as a competent but unremarkable farmer. Fortune sometimes arrives unexpectedly, my lord. Fortune. He studies me for a long moment, the specific calculating assessment of a landlord weighing whether an unusual tenant represents opportunity or threat. I won't pretend to understand exactly how a struggling farmer becomes a successful merchant within several months, but I'll acknowledge the practical result. My rents arrive on schedule, my tenant village isn't suffering the hunger-driven unrest that difficult harvests typically produce, and whatever you're actually doing hasn't yet given me specific cause for complaint. I appreciate your patience with an explanation that's admittedly incomplete, my lord. Incomplete. He allows the word to sit with specific weight, the particular pause of someone deciding how hard to press an advantage he hasn't yet fully identified. I won't press further today. Prosperity that pays its obligations reliably is more valuable to me than poverty that requires constant management. But I'd advise caution, Suil, regarding how visibly this prosperity continues growing. Caution regarding what specifically, my lord? Vesson's expression carries something that might be genuine, if calculating concern beneath his aristocratic reserve. I'm a minor lord, managing a minor holding, with minor ambitions beyond simply maintaining what stability I currently possess. But prosperity this unusual, emerging this quickly, from a source this unexplained, it attracts attention from interests considerably larger than my own modest concerns. Interests that don't share my current patience regarding incomplete explanations. You're referring to something specific. I'm referring to the general truth that unusual wealth, however legitimately earned, rarely escapes notice from those who consider themselves entitled to control wealth's distribution within their domain. His tone carries the specific weight of someone offering genuine warning rather than simple veiled threat. Be careful, tenant farmer turned merchant. Prosperity attracts attention from those positioned considerably higher than a minor lord like myself. I leave the audience with Vesson's warning settling into my thinking alongside everything Mira previously revealed about her father's ruin. The specific growing awareness that hollowback trading's success, however carefully structured to avoid obvious scrutiny, has already begun attracting notice from forces I haven't yet fully identified or understood. That evening, reporting the exchange to Mira and Bertram at our modest operational headquarters, a rented storeroom in Oakwell that's gradually accumulating the infrastructure of genuine commercial operation, I process the warning's actual implications with the specific calculating thoroughness that's governed every decision since the shrine first activated. He's not wrong to worry, Mira says, once I've relayed Vessen's specific phrasing. My father's collapse started with exactly this kind of unwelcome attention, success visible enough to draw notice from interests that don't tolerate competition they can't directly control. You think this is the Council of Grain specifically? Already? I think it's too early to know for certain. But the pattern you're describing, unusual prosperity, a landlord warning about attention from those positioned higher, that's exactly the kind of vague, deniable warning that precedes more direct pressure based on everything I remember from watching my father's business unravel. Bertram, listening with the specific thoughtful attention that's defined his contribution to our partnership beyond simple ingredient procurement, offers his own perspective. My court experience suggests something similar. Powerful interests rarely announce themselves directly at first. They send warnings through intermediaries, test how a target responds to implied pressure before committing to more direct action. I think about the accumulated weight of everything the past 10 weeks have taught me, a system that transforms desperate offerings into genuine abundance, a partnership built from calculated trust rather than naive friendship, a name attached to systematic exploitation that's shaped my entire life's hardship, and now, a specific warning suggesting that whatever I've built has already drawn attention from forces considerably larger than a minor lord's modest concerns. Then we proceed carefully, I say. The specific measured determination that's replaced whatever naive relief I initially felt, discovering the system's basic mechanics. We continue building. We continue learning exactly what we're actually facing. And we prepare as thoroughly as possible for whatever attention eventually decides to become considerably more direct than vague warnings delivered through a minor lord's cautious concern. Mira raises an eyebrow, the specific professional acknowledgement of someone recognizing genuine strategic thinking rather than simple bravado. That's a considerably more ambitious plan than sell grain carefully and hope nobody notices. Careful selling got us this far. But careful alone won't be sufficient if what's coming is actually what your father faced. Bertram nods slowly, his own expression carrying the specific weight of someone who's watched powerful interests destroy people who assumed careful compliance alone would guarantee safety. Then we prepare for something considerably larger than we originally intended to build. The blue window flickers in my peripheral vision, patient as always, waiting for whatever next sample I choose to test. 10 weeks since a desperate offering to a forgotten goddess, a trading operation growing beyond my original modest ambitions. A landlord's careful warning suggesting attention from forces I've only begun to understand. I intend to be ready for whatever comes next, however much preparation that eventually requires. Mira's research into the Council of Grain accelerates over the following month, driven by a combination of practical business necessity and the specific, carefully managed personal motivation of someone finally positioned to understand the mechanism that destroyed her father. I'm not doing this for revenge, she tells me, during one of our now regular strategy sessions at the Oakwell storeroom that's gradually transformed into genuine operational headquarters. I'm doing this because understanding our actual competitor matters for legitimate business planning. The fact that understanding also happens to address something personal is simply efficient. I don't fully believe the careful professional framing, and I suspect she doesn't either, but I respect the specific discipline it takes to pursue genuine investigation while maintaining that particular fiction. Her father's ruin clearly still shapes decisions she frames as pure business calculation. The picture that emerges, assembled through weeks of careful inquiry across multiple markets, old trading contacts, and Bertram's gradually expanding network of court gossip filtered through his former noble kitchen connections, describes something considerably more organized than scattered aristocratic greed. The Council of Grain isn't a formal institution. No charter, no official meeting hall, no acknowledged membership roster that any government record would recognize. It's an informal but remarkably stable coordination among 7 or 8 of Estenor's largest grain-producing noble houses, operating through private arrangements that never require written documentation traceable to any single conspiracy. The mechanism, once understood, proves elegantly simple in its cruelty. During productive years, the Council's member houses deliberately withhold portions of their harvest from market circulation, storing genuine surplus rather than selling it at the lower prices abundant supply would naturally produce. This artificial scarcity keeps prices consistently higher than genuine market conditions would otherwise support, benefiting the Council's coordinated interests at the direct expense of smaller farmers and merchants who lack equivalent storage capacity or market influence. During genuinely lean years, droughts, poor harvests, the kind of hardship that struck Millhaven this past season, the Council releases portions of its withheld surplus strategically, at inflated prices that exploit desperate demand, simultaneously presenting themselves publicly as generous suppliers, preventing worse famine, while privately profiting enormously from crisis. Their own previous withholding helped intensify. Smaller competitors who attempt honest competition, like Mira's father, face a specific, coordinated response. The Council's combined resources allow temporary, localized price undercutting severe enough to bankrupt independent operations, followed by acquisition of the ruined competitors' remaining assets and market relationships for a fraction of their genuine value. It's not simple greed, Bertram observes, during the strategy session where we finally assemble the complete mechanism from accumulated fragments. It's systematic. Deliberate. A structural approach to maintaining permanent market dominance through engineered scarcity and coordinated financial warfare against anyone who threatens their control. I think about Millhaven, about Doyun's death during a famine winter that killed 11 children, about whether that specific tragedy connects to this exact mechanism operating even then, years before I understood any of this structure existed. The calculation produces a specific cold anger that I recognize as considerably more personal than the careful professional framing Mira maintains regarding her own father's ruin. How many houses, specifically, I ask, working through implications with the particular thoroughness that calculating survival trained into every important decision I've made since childhood. We have partial names, Mira says, consulting notes she's compiled through weeks of careful cross-referencing. House Ashford, House Reventon, and House Calloway feature consistently across multiple independent accounts of coordinated price manipulation. Bertram's court connections suggest at least 2 additional houses, though we lack the same level of confirming detail. 5 houses minimum, Bertram confirms, possibly more. Enough combined agricultural holdings to genuinely control a significant percentage of the kingdom's total grain production, especially concentrated in the eastern and central provinces where most of the realm's actual farmland exists. Hollowback trading, meanwhile, continues growing at a pace that inevitably begins registering as genuine market disruption rather than simply successful small-scale commerce. Our consistently low, stable prices on grain and preserved goods, the direct result of cloned abundance that costs us essentially nothing beyond patient hourly attention, start undercutting the Council's carefully maintained price structures in several regional markets where we've expanded operations. The first direct retaliation arrives roughly 2 weeks after Vessen's careful warning, delivered not through subtle bureaucratic pressure, but through considerably more direct means. Our primary storage warehouse in Oakwell, recently expanded to accommodate growing inventory across multiple product lines, catches fire during the night, the specific timing and circumstances that Mira, drawing on her own painful experience with her father's earlier troubles, immediately identifies as deliberate rather than accidental. Warehouse fires happen, she says, surveying the smoking ruins alongside Bertram and myself the following morning, her voice carrying the specific flat control of someone suppressing genuine fury beneath professional assessment. They also get deliberately started by interests wanting to send a message without leaving evidence that survives formal investigation. This fire started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, according to the pattern of burn damage. That's not accident. That's arson, competently executed by someone who understood exactly how to make the aftermath ambiguous. The losses prove significant but not catastrophic. Roughly a third of our current inventory, mostly consisting of goods whose cloning windows had already closed, meaning the specific loss represents genuine, non-recoverable capital rather than something I could theoretically clone again given sufficient time. We'd managed, through Bertram's quick thinking during the fire itself, to salvage our most recently acquired and still clonable samples, the specific items whose 24-hour windows remained active and therefore worth prioritizing during frantic emergency salvage. This is a warning, I say, processing the specific message embedded in an attack calibrated to hurt without proving fatal, significant enough to demonstrate genuine capability and intent, restrained enough to avoid destroying an operation they might still prefer to simply absorb or control rather than eliminate entirely. That matches exactly what happened to my father, Mira confirms, her voice carrying old, still raw pain beneath careful professional composure. Warnings first. Then, if the warnings don't produce compliance, escalation toward actual destruction. Bertram, whose court experience provides a specific different angle on the incident, offers additional context that reshapes our understanding of the threat's actual sophistication. This wasn't clumsy intimidation. Whoever executed this fire understood exactly how to calibrate damage. Enough to hurt, not enough to justify the kind of formal investigation that might actually trace responsibility back to whoever ordered it. That's not simple noble muscle. That's someone experienced in exactly this kind of deniable, coordinated pressure. The specific names Bertram gradually accumulates through his ongoing court connections, filtered carefully through former colleagues who maintain positions in various noble households despite his own exile, begin providing concrete detail beyond Mira's initial research. House Ashford, he reports, several days after the fire, during a strategy session conducted with considerably more security precaution than our previous casual meetings. Lord Ashford's steward reportedly met privately with representatives from at least 2 other council houses. Within the same week, your Oakwell operation started drawing genuine market attention. The timing aligns too precisely to dismiss as coincidence. Meeting to discuss what specifically? My source couldn't confirm exact content. These meetings maintain considerable discretion, precisely because they'd constitute damning evidence if ever exposed publicly. But the pattern matches exactly what you'd expect. Coordinated response to a competitive threat, discussed privately among the interests most directly affected by whatever's disrupting their carefully maintained market control. I process the accumulated evidence with the specific cold calculation that's defined every important decision since the shrine first activated. A warehouse fire calibrated to warn rather than destroy. Private noble coordination timed precisely with our operation's growing market impact. A mechanism of systematic exploitation that likely contributed to tragedies stretching back through years I've spent calculating survival within scarcity I never fully understood was partially engineered. That evening, needing perspective beyond pure strategic calculation, I make the journey back to Millhaven for the first time in nearly 2 months. The specific personal grounding that our growing conflict with forces considerably larger than ourselves makes suddenly, urgently necessary. The village looks different than the desperate, drought-stricken community I left behind months earlier. Children play in the central square with the specific unguarded energy that comes from bellies that have actually been full through an entire winter, rather than the careful, subdued conservation of energy that hunger typically enforces on those too young to fully understand why their bodies feel perpetually tired. Old Tobias, whose joints no longer permit heavy farm work, sits outside his cottage watching the children with visible contentment, raising a hand in greeting as I pass. The widow Han's 3 children, considerably healthier than when I last saw them distributing that first miraculous bread, run past chasing something in a game whose rules I don't fully follow but whose energy speaks clearly enough about their actual well-being. I sit for a while at the edge of the village square, watching the specific ordinary contentment that months of reliable food security have produced in a community that spent generations calculating scarcity the way I once did myself. This is why the growing conflict with the Council of Grain matters beyond simple business competition or even personal vendetta regarding Mira's father or my own brother's death. Millhaven represents exactly the kind of community the Council's engineered scarcity systematically exploits. Hardworking, honest, perpetually vulnerable to manipulated market conditions that keep genuine prosperity permanently just beyond reach. I think about how many other Millhavens exist across Estenor's farmland, similarly caught within the same engineered cycle of scarcity and debt that the Council maintains for its own concentrated benefit. The blue window flickers in my peripheral vision as evening settles over the village, patient as always, waiting for whatever sample I choose to test next in service of an ambition that's grown considerably beyond simple personal survival. 2 months since a desperate offering to a forgotten goddess. A trading empire beginning to draw dangerous attention. A concrete understanding of exactly what mechanism has shaped my entire life's hardship, and the hardship of countless communities like the one currently sitting peacefully around me in the gathering dusk. I watch the children play a while longer, letting the specific, quiet satisfaction of their obvious well-being settle the particular resolve that's been building since the warehouse fire first confirmed we're facing something considerably more organized and dangerous than simple market competition. Whatever comes next, whatever escalation the Council of Grain eventually decides to pursue against an operation threatening their carefully maintained control, I intend to meet it prepared, informed, and unwilling to simply retreat back into the careful, hungry calculation that defined my entire life before a forgotten goddess's altar offered an unexpected second chance. Tomorrow, more preparation, more careful understanding of exactly what we're facing. Tonight, watching children who no longer calculate hunger the way I once did myself, I let the moment simply confirm why this fight, however dangerous it eventually becomes, remains genuinely worth pursuing. The Council of Grain's response to our continued growth arrives roughly 6 weeks after the warehouse fire, considerably larger in scope than anything we'd anticipated, calibrated with a specific cruelty that confirms exactly how coordinated and deliberate their entire operation actually is. Mira brings the first reports to our now heavily secured Oakwell headquarters with visible alarm breaking through her usual professional composure. Grain prices across 3 eastern provinces jumped nearly triple within the same week, not gradual market fluctuation, sudden, coordinated, simultaneous across regions that don't typically share supply chains closely enough to justify identical timing. I review the specific data she's compiled with the same careful, calculating attention I've applied to every important decision since the shrine first activated. The pattern confirms itself precisely as her alarm suggests. Multiple council-affiliated houses, across geographically separated provinces, apparently withholding grain simultaneously, producing artificial scarcity severe enough to trigger genuine hunger crisis among populations that had reasonable harvest yields this particular season. They're not just defending market share anymore, Bertram observes, studying the same reports with his own specific expertise regarding how coordinated noble action typically operates. This is punishment, calibrated to hurt the general population specifically in regions where hollow-back trading has grown most successful, likely intending to associate our operations' presence with the resulting hardship. The implication crystallizes with specific, cold clarity. The Council isn't simply trying to eliminate our competitive threat through direct attack. They're manufacturing a genuine humanitarian crisis, deliberately timed and positioned to make our growing trading operation appear responsible for market instability we didn't actually cause, while simultaneously punishing the populations who've benefited from our lower prices. I travel personally to the most severely affected province within days of confirming the pattern. Aldwych, a farming region roughly a week's travel from Oakwell, where hollowback trading has established some of our most successful distribution relationships over the preceding months. What I find matches the worst of Millhaven's own drought-driven hardship, deliberately manufactured rather than weather-driven this time. Markets with empty stalls despite reasonable regional harvests. Families rationing meals with the specific careful desperation I remember intimately from my own childhood. Children with the particular quiet, energy-conserving stillness that malnutrition produces in the young. The exact pattern that preceded Do-hyun's death 7 years earlier. I returned to Oakwell carrying the specific personal weight of witnessed suffering that transforms abstract strategic calculation into something considerably more urgent and morally immediate. We need to act, I tell Mira and Bertram, the specific determination that's been building since Millhaven's peaceful evening now sharpening into concrete resolve. Not carefully, not gradually, immediately, and at a scale that actually addresses what's happening in Aldwych and wherever else this artificial crisis is spreading. Mira's response carries the specific weight of someone calculating practical risk against moral urgency. If you flood affected markets with obviously abundant, impossibly cheap food, you're not just undercutting the Council's price manipulation. You're demonstrating a supply capacity that no legitimate trading operation our size should possess. That draws exactly the kind of scrutiny you've spent months carefully avoiding. I understand the risk. Do you? The Crown itself might start asking questions we can't safely answer if our apparent supply capacity becomes visibly, undeniably impossible according to any normal agricultural accounting. Not just the Council, royal investigators, curious about a trading company that somehow produces abundance completely disconnected from any traceable production source. I process her genuinely valid concern with the same careful calculation that's governed every important decision since the system first activated, weighing accumulated caution against the specific moral weight of witnessed suffering that direct exposure to Aldwich's manufactured crisis has made newly, urgently, immediate. Bertram, who's remained notably quiet through the exchange, finally speaks with a directness that surprises me given his usual careful, court-trained diplomatic caution. You sat at a forgotten shrine, half-starved yourself, and shared your last piece of bread with a goddess you didn't believe existed, because the alternative was letting that bread go to waste while you calculated whether pure selfishness was actually justified given your own desperate circumstances. His expression carries the specific weight of someone who's heard the full story of the system's origin and is now applying its earliest lesson directly to present circumstances. That was the same dilemma you're facing now, just considerably smaller in scale. What's actually changed, besides the size of the stakes involved? The observation lands with specific, uncomfortable clarity. I think about that first night at the shrine, about the careful calculation between immediate sharing and patient strategic accumulation, about the specific choice I made to help Millhaven cautiously, rather than recklessly, exposing an impossible source of abundance. But Millhaven's crisis was natural, weather-driven, requiring careful discretion primarily to protect my own personal safety from unwanted attention. Aldwich's crisis is deliberately manufactured by forces actively trying to destroy an operation built specifically to help exactly the kind of struggling communities now suffering under their calculated cruelty. The stakes have changed, I say, working through the distinction with the specific thoroughness that's defined every important decision since the shrine first activated. This isn't natural scarcity I'm cautiously addressing. This is deliberate cruelty, engineered specifically to hurt people and discredit our operation simultaneously. Responding with the same careful caution that protected me from a natural drought feels like accepting the Council's framing that we should retreat rather than confront manufactured suffering directly. So you're choosing exposure risk over continued caution, Mira says. Not quite a question. The specific professional assessment of someone confirming a decision's actual shape before committing resources toward its execution. I'm choosing to save thousands of people from a crisis specifically engineered to hurt them, using every resource currently available to me, and accepting whatever scrutiny that eventually produces as a cost worth paying. I meet her gaze directly, the specific confidence that months of building genuine partnership has gradually replaced whatever initial uncertainty characterized our earliest cautious negotiations. We built hollowback trading as legitimate cover precisely for moments like this one. Let's use it. The operation that follows consumes nearly 3 weeks of exhausting, continuous effort, Mira coordinating logistics across multiple affected provinces, Bertram traveling constantly to source additional food samples from unaffected regions for continued cloning, myself maintaining the specific, relentless hourly attention that maximizing our cloning capacity requires across an unprecedented, sustained operational tempo. We flood Aldwych and the other affected provinces with grain, preserved goods, and basic foodstuffs, sold through hollowback trading at cost, no profit margin, simply the specific humanitarian flood of abundance calculated precisely to break the Council's engineered scarcity before it claims the kind of casualties that Millhaven's own drought once produced. The crisis breaks faster than the Council apparently anticipated. Within 2 weeks of our full intervention, Aldwich's markets stabilize, prices return to sustainable levels, and the specific desperate hunger I witnessed during my initial visit begins visibly receding across the province. Word spreads faster than either Mira or Bertram's careful risk calculations anticipated, not the specific mechanics of our supply source, which we're careful never to explain beyond vague references to extensive supplier networks, but the general narrative of hollowback trading, arriving with impossible abundance precisely when struggling communities needed relief, most desperately. You're becoming a folk hero, Mira observes, roughly 3 weeks into the operation, reviewing the specific, unprecedented positive attention our company has begun receiving across affected regions, which is either wonderful for long-term business reputation or considerably dangerous depending on who specifically starts paying closer attention to exactly how we accomplished what we just did. The specific danger she's anticipating arrives within days, though not in the form either of us initially expected. A formal legal complaint reaches hollowback trading through official channels, not violence, not further sabotage, but considerably more sophisticated pressure. House Ashford, on behalf of what the complaint carefully describes as affected regional grain interests, formally petitions the Crown to investigate our trading company for suspicious commercial practices, potentially destabilizing legitimate market operations. The specific legal framing proves calculated precisely to avoid revealing the Council's own engineered crisis while simultaneously casting our humanitarian intervention as the actual source of market disruption, a sophisticated inversion that transforms our rescue operation into the formal accusation's central evidence of wrongdoing. They're accusing us, Bertram says, reading the formal complaint with visible, controlled fury, of causing the exact crisis we just spent 3 weeks and considerable resources actually solving. That's precisely the point, Mira says, her own voice carrying the specific bitter recognition of tactics she's watched destroy her father's business through similar legal manipulation. They can't openly admit to engineering artificial scarcity, so they're inverting the narrative completely, positioning our relief effort as the actual market disruption, using their own manufactured crisis as evidence against us rather than against themselves. I process the accumulated situation with the specific cold calculation that's governed every important strategic decision since the system's activation, a formal royal summons approaching, requiring explanation of our trading company's actual practices and supply sources precisely timed to force exactly the kind of exposure and scrutiny we've spent months carefully avoiding. This is what Vesson warned about, I say, working through the implication with specific, focused clarity, attention from forces considerably larger than a minor lord's modest concerns. We're being summoned to formally answer for exactly the kind of unusual prosperity that's been building since I first cloned that piece of bread. What do we do? Bertram asks, the specific question that's occupied our strategic planning since the formal complaint first arrived. I think about the shrine, about Do-hyun, about Aldwich's now stabilizing markets, and the specific children I watched recovering from manufactured hunger during my visit there. I think about the accumulated evidence Mira and Bertram have painstakingly assembled regarding the Council's actual coordinated exploitation, evidence that's remained strategically unused while we focused on building our own operations' stability and reach. We prepare for the summons, I say, the specific determination crystallizing into concrete strategic direction. Not with fear, and not simply hoping careful evasion will somehow satisfy royal scrutiny. We prepare to answer honestly enough to survive examination, while simultaneously presenting everything we've documented regarding the Council's actual engineered exploitation. You want to turn their attack into our opportunity, Mira says, the specific recognition of someone finally seeing the complete strategic shape I've been working towards since witnessing Aldwich's manufactured suffering. I want to stop calculating survival within scarcity someone else engineers deliberately, I say, the specific personal weight of childhood hunger and Do-hyun's preventable death settling into words that carry considerably more than simple business strategy. If the Crown is finally paying attention, we make sure they see the complete picture, not just an unusual trading company's success, but the actual mechanism that's been manufacturing hardship across this kingdom's farming communities for years. The blue window flickers in my peripheral vision, patient as always, while outside our Oakwell headquarters, formal preparations begin for a royal summons that will determine whether everything we've built survives genuine exposure or whether the Council of Grain's sophisticated counterattack successfully buries our operation beneath accusations calculated precisely to invert truth into convenient fiction. 3 months since a desperate offering to a forgotten goddess, a humanitarian crisis addressed at genuine cost and risk. A formal summons approaching that will test everything we've built against forces considerably more powerful and sophisticated than anything I originally anticipated facing. I intend to meet it with the complete truth we've assembled, whatever that honesty eventually costs. The formal summons arrives 8 days after House Ashford's complaint, carrying the specific weight of genuine royal authority rather than the deniable, indirect pressure the Council has favored throughout our preceding conflict. Hollowbeak Trading is ordered to appear before King Aldrich IV's court in the capital to answer allegations of suspicious commercial practices potentially destabilizing legitimate market operations, with formal evidence to be presented by representatives of the affected noble houses. The 3 weeks preceding our required appearance become the most intensive preparation of the entire venture, not simply defensive planning, but the specific, careful construction of a countercase that transforms royal scrutiny from existential threat into genuine opportunity. Mira works with focused, relentless intensity, converting months of careful investigation into formally organized evidence suitable for royal examination. Documented testimony from smaller merchants and farmers, ruined by coordinated council pricing manipulation, financial records demonstrating suspicious storage patterns during supposedly lean harvest years, timeline documentation connecting council house meetings directly to specific market manipulations, including the artificial crisis we recently addressed in Aldwych. Bertram leverages his remaining court connections with the specific thoroughness of someone finally deploying expertise he's carefully husbanded since his own political exile, gathering additional testimony from household staff across several council-affiliated estates, servants who've witnessed private meetings, overheard careful discussions never meant for outside ears, willing to speak now given proper protection, and the specific accumulating momentum of evidence suggesting genuine accountability might finally be possible. I prepare my own testimony with particular care, working through the specific challenge that's occupied my thinking since the summons first arrived. How to explain Hollowback Trading's unusual prosperity convincingly enough to satisfy royal scrutiny without exposing the system's actual mechanics to a court where powerful interests might simply decide such a mechanism belongs to the crown rather than to the tenant farmer who discovered it. You need something between full truth and obvious deception, Mira advises, during our final preparation session before departing for the capital. something that acknowledges genuine unusual capability without inviting demands for complete mechanical explanation. I settle, after considerable deliberation, on language that emphasizes result over mechanism, a personally discovered method of preserving and multiplying harvest yields, developed through careful experimentation, whose specific process I'm not prepared to fully disclose but whose actual results remain verifiable and consistent. The royal court itself proves considerably more intimidating in person than any preparation fully anticipated, a grand chamber designed specifically to overwhelm petitioners with the visible weight of concentrated power, King Aldrich IV seated at its center with the specific attentive gravity of a monarch who's learned, through years of rule, to distinguish genuine substance from mere aristocratic posturing. House Ashford's representative opens the proceedings with confident, well-rehearsed presentation, describing hollow-bake trading's suspicious market disruption with the specific, careful framing that transforms our humanitarian intervention in Aldwych into evidence of destabilizing commercial recklessness rather than crisis response. This trading company, the representative concludes, operates with supply capacity impossible to reconcile with any legitimate agricultural production the Crown's own records can verify. We respectfully submit that such impossible abundance suggests either illegal smuggling operations undermining proper trade regulation or some manner of deception that royal investigation should thoroughly examine. The King's attention shifts toward our own position, the specific formal invitation for response that determines whether months of careful preparation translate into genuine defense or simple confirmation of the accusations already leveled against us. Mira presents first, her voice carrying the specific controlled precision of someone who's waited years for exactly this opportunity to formally expose the mechanism that destroyed her father. She lays out documented evidence methodically, merchant testimony, financial records, the specific pattern of coordinated council pricing manipulation stretching back years before hollowback trading even existed as an operation. Your Majesty, she concludes, the actual market instability didn't originate with our company's growth. It originated with a coordinated group of noble houses deliberately engineering scarcity and inflated pricing for their own concentrated benefit, at direct cost to smaller farmers, merchants, and the common families who depend on stable food access. Our company's success simply exposed a manipulation that's operated, undetected, for considerably longer than our own brief existence. The specific weight of her testimony visibly affects the court's assembled attention, whispered reactions among observing nobles, the King's own expression shifting from initial formal neutrality toward genuine focused concern as Bertram follows with his own testimony, presenting servant accounts and specific meeting documentation that transforms Mira's broader pattern into concrete, dated evidence of coordinated conspiracy. House Ashford's representative attempts rebuttal, but the specific accumulated weight of documented testimony proves increasingly difficult to dismiss as simple coincidental market patterns or sour grapes from a struggling competitor. The moment I've most carefully prepared for and most anxiously anticipated arrives when the King's own questioning turns directly toward me. You claim a personally developed method of multiplying harvest yields, King Aldrich says, his tone carrying the specific measured skepticism of a ruler who's heard many convenient explanations across years of court proceedings. Explain this method or demonstrate it directly if you expect this court to accept testimony resting on such an unverifiable foundation. The specific trap embedded in the demand registers immediately. House Ashford's representative watching with visible anticipation, apparently expecting either an impossible explanation that discredits my testimony entirely, or a demonstration request I can't satisfy without exposing something considerably more dangerous than simple commercial secrecy. I process the decision with the same calculating thoroughness that's governed every important choice since the shrine first activated, weighing the specific risk of partial demonstration against the alternative of watching our entire case collapse under royal skepticism regarding claims I can't otherwise substantiate. Your Majesty, I say, I can demonstrate a result, though I ask the court's understanding that the complete mechanism remains something I'm not prepared to fully explain, for reasons I believe will become apparent. I request a simple piece of bread from the court's own kitchen. Ordinary, unremarkable, definitively not something I could have prepared or manipulated in advance. Once provided, I taste it directly before the assembled court's full attention, then place it on a small table specifically arranged for the demonstration. The wait proves excruciating, the system's hourly restriction meaning I can't simply produce an immediate result, requiring instead the specific, uncomfortable explanation that any demonstration will require patient waiting rather than immediate magical display. The method requires time, I explain, meeting the king's skeptical attention directly. I can show your majesty the beginning of the process now and confirm its completion within the hour if the court is willing to extend proceedings accordingly. The specific tension that follows, House Ashford's representative visibly hoping the delay itself discredits my claims, the king's own patience visibly tested but not yet exhausted, resolves when, exactly 1 hour later, I retrieve the bread from its resting place and it has, unmistakably, become two identical pieces. The specific reaction that ripples through the assembled court, gasps, whispered exclamations, the king's own composed expression finally cracking into genuine startled attention, confirms that whatever skepticism preceded the demonstration has been thoroughly, dramatically overcome. This is. King Aldrich studies the duplicated bread with the specific, careful examination of someone confirming impossibility with his own direct senses rather than simply accepting testimony. This is not deception. This is genuine, verified multiplication, achieved through means you're not prepared to explain. I ask your majesty's understanding, I say, choosing words with the specific, careful precision that's governed every major decision since the system first activated, that full disclosure of the mechanism risks considerably more danger than simple commercial secrecy. Whatever this ability actually is, I've used it to feed a starving village, to build a legitimate trading company employing dozens across multiple provinces, and, most recently, to address a humanitarian crisis that this court's own investigation should confirm was deliberately manufactured by the very houses now accusing me of market disruption. The king studies me for a long, waited moment, the specific calculation of a ruler weighing genuine practical benefit against the theoretical risk of an ability he doesn't fully understand remaining outside direct crown control. House Ashford, he says finally, turning his attention toward the noble representative whose confident opening has visibly deteriorated into uncertain defensive posture, you arrived today accusing this company of destabilizing commerce through impossible abundance. You now stand accused, by documented and increasingly credible testimony, of deliberately engineering the actual scarcity and crisis that necessitated this company's intervention. Explain this discrepancy, if you're able. The representative's response, increasingly defensive, increasingly unconvincing given the accumulated weight of Mira and Bertram's careful documentation, collapses further under the king's own pointed follow-up questions, until the specific fundamental truth becomes undeniable even to a court initially inclined toward skepticism regarding accusations against established noble houses. King Aldrich's eventual ruling, delivered after a brief recess to consult privately with his own advisors, addresses both the immediate accusation and the considerably larger conspiracy Mira and Bertram's evidence has exposed. This court finds insufficient evidence to support House Ashford's accusations against Hollowback Trading, he announces, his voice carrying the specific formal weight of royal judgment. Conversely, this court finds substantial, credible evidence supporting accusations of coordinated market manipulation, engineered scarcity, and deliberate humanitarian crisis creation against multiple noble houses, requiring immediate further investigation and appropriate consequence. The specific chaos that follows, House Ashford's representative attempting further defense, other noble observers visibly calculating their own potential exposure given the scope of evidence just presented, settles gradually into the king's continued formal address. Regarding the unusual ability just demonstrated, he continues, his attention returning to me directly. This court acknowledges genuine benefit already provided to this kingdom's struggling communities, without requiring complete disclosure of a mechanism whose owner has demonstrated responsible, beneficial application rather than exploitation. I will not command this crown's forceful appropriation of an ability that appears, based on demonstrated evidence, considerably safer in the hands of someone who's already proven its beneficial use than it would be in hands motivated by simple accumulation of power. The specific relief that floods through me at this ruling, not full disclosure demanded, not forceful appropriation attempted, genuine acknowledgement instead of the beneficial pattern I've established through months of careful, calculated choices, settles alongside the considerably larger victory Mira and Bertram's evidence has produced against the Council's coordinated exploitation. This matter requires further resolution, King Aldrich concludes, beyond what today's proceedings alone can properly address. I'm establishing formal investigation into the complete scope of this coordinated market manipulation, and I expect continued cooperation from Hollowback Trading in providing whatever additional evidence proves necessary to fully address a conspiracy that's apparently harmed this kingdom's farming communities for considerably longer than anyone within this court previously recognized. We leave the royal court that evening carrying the specific, exhausted relief of people who've survived a confrontation considerably more significant than any previous challenge our operation has faced, alongside the growing awareness that today's proceedings represent a genuine beginning rather than simple conclusion. "We won," Bertram says, once we're safely removed from the court's immediate vicinity, his voice carrying disbelief alongside genuine celebration. "Actually won. Against the council, in front of the king himself. We exposed them," Mira corrects, though her own expression carries visible, hard-won satisfaction beneath careful professional composure. "Full resolution requires considerably more than today's initial hearing, but my father's ruin finally has acknowledgement, from the highest possible authority. That matters, regardless of what still remains to properly resolve. I think about the shrine, about Do-hyun, about months of careful, calculated decisions that led from a desperate offering to a forgotten goddess towards standing before a king, and watching coordinated noble exploitation finally face genuine royal scrutiny. The blue window flickers in my peripheral vision, patient as always, while ahead of us lies whatever considerable work remains to fully resolve a conspiracy whose complete scope this single hearing has only begun to properly expose. 3 months since a desperate offering, a royal hearing survived and won. A conspiracy exposed before the kingdom's highest authority. Whatever comes next in fully resolving this conflict, I intend to see it through completely, however much additional work that eventually requires. A year passes between the royal hearing and the day King Aldrich IV formally dissolves the Council of Grain by decree, the specific culmination of an investigation that expanded considerably beyond what any of us originally anticipated when Mira first began compiling scattered evidence in a modest Oakwell storeroom. The investigation's full scope, once royal subpoena power granted access to previously protected noble financial records, revealed corruption considerably more extensive than even our accumulated evidence initially suggested, coordinated price manipulation across nearly a decade, documented connections between at least 7 noble houses rather than the 5 we'd originally confirmed, and direct evidence linking specific engineered scarcity events to at least 3 previous famine winters. Including, I learn with a specific cold vindication I hadn't expected to feel so completely. The exact famine that killed my brother 7 years earlier. The revelation, when Mira brings me the specific documentation confirming council involvement in that particular historical crisis, produces a grief considerably more complicated than simple confirmation of suspected injustice. They didn't cause the drought that year, she clarifies carefully, understanding the specific weight this information carries for me personally. But records show House Callaway deliberately withheld regional grain reserves during that exact famine winter, calculating that desperate demand would justify prices considerably beyond what honest distribution of existing surplus would have required. Your brother's death wasn't simply natural tragedy. It was natural tragedy made considerably worse by deliberate profit-seeking exploitation of a crisis they could have eased. I sit with that information for several days, processing grief that's technically 7 years old, but carries newly sharpened edges now that abstract natural misfortune has crystallized into specific documented human choice. Do-hyun didn't simply die from bad weather and insufficient family resources. He died, at least partially, because a noble house calculated that his family's desperation was more profitable than his survival. The knowledge doesn't produce simple, vengeful satisfaction once House Callaway faces formal consequence. Considerable land confiscation, removal of the current lord from his position, criminal proceedings against the specific stewards who executed the deliberate withholding decision. It produces something more complicated, a grief finally given somewhere legitimate to rest, alongside renewed determination that whatever role I now hold within this kingdom's future should ensure no other family calculates survival mathematics as brutal as the ones that shaped my own childhood. King Aldrich's formal decree doesn't simply dissolve the Council of Grain as an informal conspiracy. It restructures the kingdom's entire grain oversight system, a new formal position, created specifically in response to everything our case exposed, tasked with monitoring regional harvest yields, preventing future coordinated market manipulation, and ensuring crisis response mechanisms exist independent of noble houses' potentially compromised self-interest. He appoints me to that position personally, the specific formal title of Royal Minister of Provisions carrying considerably more weight and responsibility than I fully anticipated when our original case first sought simple justice rather than permanent institutional authority. You understand this crisis's actual mechanics better than any career bureaucrat currently in my service, the king tells me, during the private audience where he formally offers the position. Not simply the noble conspiracy's structure, though your investigation's thoroughness there proves considerably valuable. You understand hunger itself, from lived experience rather than theoretical policy study. That understanding matters more, for this specific role, than traditional court credentials ever could. I accept. The specific weight of formal royal service settling alongside everything else the preceding year has built, a legitimate trading empire, genuine partnership with people who've become considerably more than simple business associates, and now, institutional authority to address hunger's actual causes rather than simply responding to individual crises through personal, limited intervention. The specific mechanics of my own abundance, the system's actual multiplication process, remain, per the king's own earlier ruling, my private secret, known completely only to Mira and Bertram, who've maintained careful discretion regarding exactly how our company's original growth actually functioned, even as our legitimate business has grown large enough to sustain itself through entirely conventional trade and agricultural investment. Mira becomes Hollow Back Trading's formal co-director, the company now holding official royal licensing for provisions logistics across multiple provinces, the specific legitimate infrastructure that grew from cautious market stall sales into genuine kingdom-spanning commercial operation. My father would have found this considerably ironic, she tells me, during the formal ceremony establishing the company's new royal charter. The exact business structure the council destroyed him for attempting, now operating with royal blessing specifically because it helped expose their corruption. He'd be proud, I say, the specific confidence that months of genuine partnership has built, replacing whatever careful hedging might once have qualified such a personal statement. He'd be insufferable about being right regarding the council's actual corruption all along, she corrects, though her expression carries genuine warmth beneath the deflecting humor. Which is its own kind of vindication, I suppose. Bertram receives formal royal appointment as chief provisions taster and rare goods procurer, the specific legitimate version of the role he's performed informally since our earliest partnership, now carrying official court recognition that effectively reverses his previous political exile. 15 years in noble kitchens taught me court politics could destroy a career through simple bad timing, he observes, during a celebratory dinner marking his formal appointment. I suppose court politics can also rebuild one, given sufficiently dramatic circumstances and a partner willing to demonstrate impossible bread multiplication before an entire assembled royal court. Lord Vesson, whose own tenuous position within the broader noble conspiracy proves considerably more peripheral than House Ashford or House Calloway's direct involvement, navigates the council's collapse through pragmatic cooperation rather than the punishment more centrally involved houses face. He becomes one of several regional oversight administrators within my new ministry structure, the specific practical alliance of someone who recognizes, with characteristic aristocratic pragmatism, that supporting the winning side of institutional reform serves his interests considerably better than defending a collapsed conspiracy he was never fully committed to regardless. You've done well for a tenant farmer, he tells me, during one of our now regular administrative meetings, his tone carrying grudging but genuine respect, rather than his earlier careful guarded warnings. Considerably better than I anticipated. When you first started paying rent suspiciously on schedule, I had good partners. You had good instincts regarding which partners to trust. That's its own kind of rare capability, particularly among people who arrive at sudden prosperity without proper preparation for navigating what attention that prosperity inevitably attracts. Millhaven, the village where this entire journey began, receives specific attention within my ministry's broader reforms. Formerly purchased from the Crown following partial land redistribution that accompanied Vesson's own repositioning, now operating free from the exploitative rent structure that once defined my family's precarious existence. The village school and modest medical clinic, funded through Hollowback Trading's legitimate profits, represent the specific concrete transformation that a desperate crestfallen offering to a forgotten goddess eventually made possible for an entire community. I returned to the shrine itself roughly a year after that first desperate night, the specific pilgrimage that's become an occasional quiet habit rather than any practical necessity for continued cloning. My ministry position and legitimate trading empire have long since surpassed any genuine need for the system's original bread and grain scale multiplication, though the ability itself remains quiet and available whenever circumstances might eventually require its direct use again. The ruined shrine looks exactly as it did that first stormy evening, crumbling stone, partial roof, the specific worn altar depression that generations of forgotten previous offerings apparently carved into its surface long before my own desperate visit. I place a simple piece of fresh bread on the altar's worn stone, the specific quiet ritual that's become personal habit rather than practical experimentation. I don't eat half this time. I leave the entire piece. You're a forgotten goddess in a ruined temple, I say aloud, the specific habit of speaking to empty stone that's developed across a year of occasional quiet visits. I was a starving farmer who found your altar and ate half your offering because I was too hungry to respect the line between sacrifice and survival. I look at the whole loaf resting on weathered stone, considering everything the past year has built from that first desperate half-eaten offering. Nobody in my lands goes hungry the way I once did. I think that's the best thanks I can actually offer you. I don't wait for any response I know won't come. I simply turn and walk back toward the path leading home, not to Millhaven's small cottage where this journey began, but to the modest but comfortable ministry residence in the capital where Mira and Bertram will likely already be waiting with whatever new administrative challenge the following week's provisions oversight requires. The forest around the shrine sits quiet in the specific gathering dusk. This year's harvest, I know from my ministry's own careful tracking, proves the best regional yield in over a decade, not through any system intervention, simply because farmers across the affected provinces no longer fear the kind of coordinated sabotage and artificial scarcity that once made honest agricultural planning such a precarious gamble. The hunger that shaped my entire childhood, that killed my brother, that defined every careful calculation I once made regarding survival's precise mathematics, that hunger hasn't been solved through a single miracle alone. It's been solved through the specific, harder work that miracle made possible: genuine partnership, patient investigation, institutional reform, and the particular courage required to expose truth even when convenient silence might have protected my own continued prosperity considerably more safely. I walk home through quiet forest, carrying the specific satisfaction of someone who transformed a desperate, half-eaten offering into considerably more than personal fortune, an actual structural change to how an entire kingdom manages the hunger that once defined every calculation of my own difficult childhood. The blue window flickers once more in my peripheral vision, patient as always, a quiet resource I rarely need anymore but carry regardless. The specific permanent reminder of exactly where this entire unlikely journey actually began. Whatever comes next in a ministry role still finding its complete shape, whatever additional challenges a kingdom's genuine provision security eventually requires addressing, I intend to meet them with the same careful, calculating determination that turned a starving farmer's desperate gamble into a kingdom's lasting reform. The forest settles into evening quiet behind me. Ahead, the capital waits, and with it, whatever considerable work remains in building something that outlasts any single miracle's temporary abundance. I walk on, unhurried finally, for the first time in longer than I can clearly remember, no longer calculating survival's precise mathematics, simply living the specific life that calculation, cunning, and one desperate night's offering eventually made possible.